Serious, what is the scariest thing that you have ever encountered while home alone? My husband was having a dude's weekend and I was home alone with our kid. The downstairs neighbors were fighting. Nothing new there when all of a sudden I heard her scream, "Help me, please God, someone help me." So loud I knew she had run out the kitchen into the back stairwell. She was crying and screaming. Their baby was screaming. Then there were thumps and more yelling. I had already called 911. And while they were getting my information, everything went silent down there. The baby suddenly stopped. Everything was quiet. I told them to hurry. The police arrived and I had to let them in the building. So much for an anonymous report. And they pounded on the downstairs door for a while with no answer. They tried calling the landlord to get permission to break down the door, but one officer came up to ask me if there was another way in. I showed them the back stairwell and said they were unlikely to have bothered locking the kitchen door. They hadn't, and the officers got in. Nobody home. They came back and asked me again what I'd heard, and another officer hung back. The family was finally found in the basement. He said they'd all been down there doing laundry and hadn't heard the police knocking. Bullshit. People down the block could hear them threatening to break down the door. We'd drawn quite a crowd. She insisted everything was fine and she and the baby were safe and sent the police on their way. Nothing they can do if she insists she's safe. I couldn't sleep all night and they were extra cold to us after that. A few months later I answered the door to 2 police officers responding to a report of DV. The downstairs neighbors claimed they'd heard screaming and thumps and then saw my husband jump in his car and speed away. I was home alone, still in my nightgown. They could see lots of skin and no visible marks. And my husband had been out of the country on business for 3 days. They got in trouble for the false report and moved out later that month. I hope she eventually left him. I had neighbors like this. One day someone was having a bad fight and we called the cops, but we weren't sure which unit it was from. They knocked on a few units to find the right one and they actually arrested a guy. The next day our shared wall next door neighbors left a passive aggressive note taped to all the doors berating the people who made a false report and disturbed their night. I tried to apologize, but they never answered their door. I wrote a note and I could hear the woman complaining how I'd had the nerve to leave the note. Turns out she was so past because they were fighting all the time. Mostly her berating him. In the time we lived there we found out their first names, what kind of pets they had, when they went from engaged to married because they stopped arguing about the upcoming wedding, and how his stepmom had ruined their now past wedding. Her job, what kind of invisible disability he had, and that he mostly sat there and took her mood swings and she spent most of her time yelling about what a disappointment he was. Good times. I was maybe 11 or 12 and was home alone one winter day. The desktop computer I was using shared a wall with our unheated garage. The house was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. All of a sudden this boom erupted from the garage that shook the wall. It honestly sounded like a bomb went off. 20 minutes later, after hiding behind the couch and getting my heart rate down, I finally went to inspect. A 2-liter Sprite bottle had frozen and exploded off the shelf. I was babysitting a family I was unfamiliar with. My parents knew them and suggested me when they needed a babysitter, and as I liked having money, I accepted. The kids go to bed and I kill time as one does before smartphones are a thing by reading, I think, maybe doing homework, but that seems unlikely. Anyways, I start to hear speaking from another room. Not just speaking, but this low, almost demonic voice speaking to another one. I'm not a religious sort, but when you realize that no, you're not just hearing things, there's definitely a voice, it's more than a little creepy. Not knowing what was going on, I slowly crept up to the doorway of the sitting room, then peered around the corner. Fucking Furbies. Talking to each other, at night, in the dark. Furbies suck. I'm pretty convinced that there's some whole story about the person that invented them was some sort of alchemist who needed to create a physical cage to trap demons in, and thus Furbies were made, and the things are practically indestructible. I mean, you can still find them in fully functional states at yard sales 15-20 years later. I'm sure if you do manage to break one, it releases the demon into the real world. But until then, the demon inside just annoys the owner until they get so frustrated that they destroy the monstrosity, which in turn releases it. I'm pretty sure it's a form of demon jail. I, Judge Bartholomew von Sulfuride III, do sentence you to 29 years of Furby solitude. May gods have mercy on your soul. For no one else will. 50 years plus on. That soul is still screaming in one of those indestructible beings. I was probably about 12. Newly allowed to be home alone for a couple hours over the summer. A man was walking through my fenced-in backyard. Walked right onto my deck to the back window. My dog was going nuts barking with her hair standing up. I had no way out of the house or to the phone without this man seeing me in the window. So I'm hiding behind the couch waiting for him to break in. When I see him exit my yard through the gate, I immediately call my mom almost in tears, and she said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you the gas meter guy was coming." Of course the gas meter is right next to the window my brother and I always used to break into our own house when we forgot our keys. My dog was the only baddest that day. We lived in a maisonette in London. We lived upstairs and a man was downstairs. He came banging at our door one day screaming that his flat was being flooded from our bathroom and to let him in. Well, I was 14 and my bro 13. Mum was out. He came in, went into the bathroom and did something. I don't know what. He was an adult and we trusted him. Well, mum called the council out and there had never been a leak. No watermarks or anything, so mum told us not to let him in again. Next time mum went out he came banging at the door again, and we told him what mum said. He went apeshit. Let me fucking IINN. Let me fucking IINN. All the while banging the duck out of the door. God knows why he wanted in. Scary. I was at a friend's house watching her cats, and suddenly someone stood on the balcony. Right when I walked down the hallway, I stopped dead and stood frozen for minutes. Heart beat up in my throat. Turns out it was my reflection. Took me solid 10 minutes. I have a mirror in my living room that's on the wall opposite the windows to the back porch. I have now twice lost my shit thinking someone had gotten in my house while I've been out working in the backyard. Nope. That's sweaty. Scary person staring at me is just my own reflection. Our garter snakes had gotten out of their cage. We searched everywhere but couldn't find them. Finally my husband went to bed and I stayed up watching TV for a while. We had one of those gigantic old console TVs we had gotten when someone was throwing it out. Suddenly one of the dust covered wires came slithering out from behind the TV. I had read Stephen King's Darlor's Claiborne not too long before. And in that book the crazy old lady thinks the wires in her house are coming alive. I had a moment of holy crap. It's actually happening. Before I realized it was one of the snakes. That got my blood pumping. You better believe. Sometimes an author or horror movie director will put something in that just doesn't seem that scary in the moment. But then something like this happens, and as obscure an occurrence it is, it sure does change the way you remember that bit from the book/movie after that. A tree branch crashed through my window when I was home alone playing Xbox. I've always thought I would be prepared for like an intruder or something. But if that was a dude that just like did that SWAT rope swing thing through my window, he would have had enough time to walk over to me, grab a gun from my hand, load it, and shoot me before I figured what the duck went on. I was like one of those goats that faint when you scream at them. The first night alone at my new house, a dude tried scouting around my home looking for a way in. I flipped on all the lights and ran downstairs as loudly as I could holding a plastic tomahawk in one hand and my phone dialing 911 in the other. He never actually got inside the house, but it was terrifying, especially since it was literally my first night of living on my own. I had a massive tub of Lego fell over while I was eating downstairs. I kid you not. It sounded like somebody went through the window. I was frozen on the spot thinking I was going to be killed or kidnapped or something. An hour and a bit passed, and I thought they must have left. I slowly went around the house looking for evidence of a break-in. Then I saw the Lego all over the floor. I was taking a nap in my apartment under blankets in my bed when I hear the door open. Thinking it's my husband, I ignore it. But about 5 minutes later, I hear several female voices. I'm thinking I'm dreaming, so again, I ignore it. The voices get louder and suddenly my bedroom door opens. I freak out and bolt upright in bed. 3 women were in my apartment. 2 young, 1 older. I shriek. They shriek. They run out of my apartment. It turned out that the management company showed the wrong apartment available for rent that day. I got an apology and a bouquet of flowers. I lived in a house with some guys in college and was homesick with a cold. I was laid up in bed, half delirious from cold medicine, and watching YouTube on my phone when there was a knock on my door. Thinking it was one of my roommates, I said come in, and in walked my landlord and 4 random dudes. Because I was a bit delirious from the cold medicine, I immediately yelled, "Who are you people? What are you doing in our house?" Exclamation mark. The landlord's eyes went wide as saucers and he hurried the guys out of the room. Got a call later from him apologizing and saying he was showing the house to prospective renters and that one of my roommates had told him it was fine. My roommate probably told me, but again, I was so out of it from being sick and taking cold medicine that I completely forgot. I was super high cleaning the apartment one day, probably around 1 PM. So the music was up. I was in my zone. Then someone started slamming on the door. It kept going. I stopped the music, thinking that maybe it was just a neighbor who wanted the music turned down. I didn't feel like answering the door because 1, I smoked a duck ton of weed, so was in no place to 2, COVID. Stopped the music, went quiet, but the aggressive knocking did not stop. So I looked through the peephole. Smaller girl a bit bigger than my stature. Never seen her before. And I live in a complex with 6 units. So I know what my neighbors look like. But she keeps knocking. Being stupid, I opened the door. She just stared. Asked where John was. I told her I don't know. There's no John here. She just stood and stared at me. Definitely on something. I tell her to try down the hall, since I think there might be one that lives down there. I slowly go to close the door and she legit shoves her foot in the crack and starts to shove. So I start to struggle back. We are both actually wrestling with this door. I just go, "What? Question mark. Can I help you? Question mark." I'm trying to close the door. She stops and relents a bit and does some weird eye shit and goes, "Oh, okay," then walks off. Locked and bolted that ducker real quick. But yeah, don't open doors to strangers. I was 11 and home alone. I got out of the shower to discover my house had been broken into. Teen from down the street and his sister were in the living room ransacking the place. My dad kept one of those glass door gun cabinets at the end of the hall by the bedroom door. I took out the first gun I could grab and yelled at them. Dude turned around with a knife, but dropped and ran when he saw the rifle. Coward shoved his sister down as he bolted back out the door. The girl stayed on the ground screaming as I called the cops. They both got arrested over a pocket full of change the guy had shoved in his hoodie. This was in the 90s in Texas and my mom was more pissed about the broken door and them touching her change jar than anything. I was babysitting my little sister. We were both watching television. All of a sudden I hear gunshots and bullets ricocheting from the window security bars. A moment later I hear moaning and screams coming from my front door. It was a drive-by shooting. 3 teenagers were shot up and managed to crawl to my door seeking help. As a 14-year-old at the time, it was something I was definitely not prepared to handle. I was home alone since my husband was away on deployment. One night as I was falling asleep, both my dog and I heard someone on the porch walking around. My dog flipped out and I decided to go downstairs. I grabbed my gun out of the safe and headed downstairs. About 2/3 of the way down I saw the man through the front door windows. We locked eyes and he said, "Let me in." I told him that he needed to leave. Again, "Let me in." I told him he needed to leave and that I was calling the cops. "Let me in." I told him I that had a gun. "So do I," and he lifted up a gun and aimed it at me. I fired my gun through the window but missed him. He ran off. The cops found him a few blocks from my house a little bit later. His gun ended up not being loaded. Still, most terrifying shit ever. My mom had went to go run errands for about 30 minutes, but she couldn't bring me, and I was around 8 at the time. It was afternoon, and I decided to take a nap, and barely even 2 minutes into sleeping I feel someone fucking grab my back with long nails. They didn't hurt, but I could still feel that they had long nails. Yes, this more than likely was sleep paralysis, but I could literally feel it. I jumped up and couldn't go back to sleep. I thought it was her messing with me, but I checked, and her car wasn't in the driveway and she wasn't in any of the rooms. I told her, and she got creeped out. I had trouble sleeping for 2 weeks after that. I was woken from a deep sleep by the most horrifying high-pitched howling noise. We live deep in a wooded area, and I was familiar with sounds like foxes barking, or even fisher cats screaming. But this was eerie, and didn't sound like an animal. Then it came from the other side of the house. But there was no sound of anything walking. You know how your mind isn't really logical when you first wake? I was convinced it was some terrible otherworldly creature. In the morning I checked some online recordings of sounds to figure it out. Turned out to be a tiny harmless screech owl. Little guy can make some demonic sounds though. Late at night I had both my cat and my girlfriend's dog start freaking out. I got up, grabbed my gun and flashlight, and went through the house. Both the animals were growling and hissing at one of the vents, so I went over and shined my light into it and saw a cat. Turns out the previous tenants left their cats and there was a way for animals to get into the ventilation. Fun stuff. I was left home alone to watch the dogs while my parents did a carriage job. I was sitting near a window watching random videos on my phone. Being home alone at night always makes me uneasy, and the fact I was watching the occasional horror game did not help. I looked over at the window and saw two glowing eyes staring in at me. I literally screamed and almost fell out of my seat. It was my cat. She wanted to come inside. Had sleep paralysis for the first time home alone when I was like 15. Scary AF. I was homesick and I thought I heard a little girl call my name, then I couldn't move and my jaw was opening but I couldn't shut it. Then boom, I'm moving again. Couldn't understand what had just happened and I thought ghosts could be real until I learned what sleep paralysis was. Had it twice now. When I was 12, a drunk neighbor tried winning back the affections of his ex by beating on her window with a plastic chair, shouting "Come out here you stupid bitch" at around midnight, then threatened to harm anyone who tried to stop him. So one summer after all my roommates went back home, I was living alone in a college apartment complex. One night I decided to go to the bars and then Uber home, relatively safe college town. I had done this plenty of times before, and the city is pretty empty in the summer. I stepped out of the Uber and started walking up the stairs to my apartment when two men came down at the same time. My guess is they saw me exit the ride. They approached me and started complimenting me, asking for my number and where I was going. I brushed it off but really had nowhere else to go other than in my apartment, since my car keys were in there. So when I reached the door I was like, oh, my boyfriend lives here. He's inside waiting for me. And one of them said, no, you don't have a boyfriend. We've seen you alone, which was a major red flag. Like major, but I had no other choice but to just run inside. Now I know I probably should have called the cops here, but they left me alone. So I left it alone. Well, the next night I was laying on my couch, directly in front of the front door, watching TV when I start to hear the door handle rattle. I freak out and go still and silent. Then I start to hear it get a little more forceful and it sounds like someone is pushing on the door. I tiptoed to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find. Went towards the door to look through the peephole at a distance, and it was the two guys from last night. Now I'm a pretty petite female, so I knew that I was no match. The two of them started knocking really loud, yelling that I needed to open the door. I ran to the end of the hallway and called 911. They started kicking the door, and at this point I was full on shaking, just full of adrenaline, but the operator was keeping me sane. At one point the knocking and bangs stopped for about 5 minutes, and I was finally able to relax, and the operator let me know the cops were at the apartment looking for the guys. About 15 minutes later there was another knock at the door, and it was the cops. They let me know that they searched the whole complex before coming over, but couldn't find the two guys, but had seen similar reports of harassment and break-ins in the area from other females, and lectured me about how I should have reported it sooner. Needless to say, I went home for the rest of the summer and didn't come back until it was time to move out. If you enjoy watching these videos, make sure to hit the subscribe button and like this video. Thanks.